In 1883, Henry George said, "History shifts at pivot points, and there are no points more pivotal than when banks approach the abyss." If then, as George suggests, financial crises are indeed societal crises, then their opacity poses a serious problem for our ability to understand how our society moves and breathes. Examples of how economic and financial instability have revolutionized American society are numerous. The Depression of the 1780s gave rise to the Constitution that we all know, developed in 1887. The Panic of 1837 produced widespread changes to state governance and legislatures, not to mention bankruptcy laws. And indeed, the Great Depression fostered the evolution of the American welfare state as we know it. Likewise, the Panic of 1907, which we're going to be talking about a bit today, resulted in the establishment of the Federal Reserve, an institution of unprecedented, not just domestic power, but also remarkable power all around the world. So today we want to unpack how banking crises and the Panic of 1907 in particular revolutionized the relationship between government, the public, and the financial system. The recent crisis emanating around Silicon Valley Bank, this is something that if we've been paying at all attention to the news will sound familiar to us, has shown once again how financial crises can emerge out of nowhere, quote unquote, and have the potential to upend government policy and the economic lives of millions of citizens. Today, what we want to do is examine the areas where the public sector and the private sector can work together in trying to address these kinds of issues. We will ask how public officials can mitigate crises and their effects, where private actors come into the picture, where financial shocks transmit throughout the system and influence quote unquote Main Street, because in the end, that is what touches every single corner of this country and indeed the world. So to answer these questions, we are lucky to have three experts on financial crises and their role in American society: Mary Rogers, John Moen, and Bob Bruner. I'm just going to take a moment to give a bit of an introduction to each of our guests, and then we will hit the road, so to speak. So Mary Rogers, sitting here immediately to my left, is the Marcia Belmar Wilcock Endowed Professor of Finance at the State University of New York, Oswego, and a 30-year veteran of Wall Street, mostly at Merrill Lynch. She completed her career and then received her doctorate at Pace University of New York in 2011. She also holds an MBA from the Kellogg School at Northwestern, as well as a CFA charter. Her research interests include financial markets, banking, and financial history. And it is a pleasure to have her with us today. Thank you, Mary. Next to Mary, we have John Moen. John is professor of economics and the chair of the economics department at the University of Mississippi. He currently researches estimates of historical labor force participation, but he and Mary are working on a large body of work on the Panic of 1907 and a book which we don't have a date on that yet, but they will indeed be discussing some topics on that we will be discussing throughout the day. He is a graduate of Sinolf College in Minnesota and holds an MA and PhD in economics from the University of Chicago. He also spent 4 years at the Federal Reserve, so he is an expert that can speak to this today. Welcome, John. Last, but certainly not least, down here on our end, we have Bob Bruner. Bob's titles and accolades are far too numerous to mention here in this one event, but just by way of a highlight reel, Bob is Dean Emeritus of the Darden School of Business, University Professor at the University of Virginia, and a global authority on financial crises and how they influence society. Bob is the co-author with Sean Carr of this new second volume, The Panic of 1907, Heralding a New Era of Finance, Capitalism, and Democracy, which just recently came out. I say this normally, a lot of times second editions don't necessarily have a lot of difference from the first, but Bob put a lot of work in and actually brought another 150 pages into the second edition. So in many cases, it's a new volume altogether. So I definitely recommend getting that, even if you have already read it. Bob is an integral part of our team here at the Miller Center and at UVA. And I always like to mention this, but in addition to all of his scholarly triumphs, Bob is the greatest teacher that I have ever seen in the classroom as well. So before we get started, just a couple of notes quickly on our program. Each panelist will have 5 to 10 minutes to make an opening kind of statement at the beginning. And then after that, I will facilitate a discussion. The panelists can discuss with each other, as well as I might sneak in a couple of thoughts myself, taking my prerogative. And then finally, we will and definitely want to answer questions from both our in-person and online audience. So you have note cards on your chairs. Please put your questions down there, and we will pick them up and get them up to me. So please keep that in mind. And then for our online audience, please use the chat function or the Q&A function on the Zoom window, and we will be harvesting those and getting those up to me as well. So let's get going. You've listened to me talk for long enough. I want to open it up to Mary for an opening statement. Please, Mary.
Thank you very much. Thanks very much to the Miller Center for having us here. We're delighted to be here. So next to me, we have two eminent economists, right? And I bring a different viewpoint to the story today because I'm a finance person. So when we kind of merge these ideas of economics and finance together, we kind of get a bigger, better understanding of what goes on during financial crises and how we can respond afterwards. So let's just take one quick second, well, a few more, to review what those differences are, right? Economics, writ large, is really the study of how a society tries to move from scarcity to abundance. And economists look at all the different facets of that kind of problem and try and explain how we can move from scarcity to abundance. Big story. Littler story, but a story nonetheless, is finance. So finance people live in this big story of economics, but we focus on a different part of it. Every one of you every day focuses on your financial decisions. If you have cash, you try and decide every day, should I buy a stock? Maybe not every day, but every quarter, right? Should I buy a stock? Because if you make good decisions like that, you'll help us move from scarcity to abundance. Because the stock you might decide to buy might be hitching your wagon to an entrepreneur's star, right? You might say, that's a great idea. I want to participate in those profits. If we do that, the entrepreneur might be able to come up with a new idea, create more goods, get us to abundance, create jobs, get us to abundance, right? So how do each one of us make that financial decision about what to do with our cash? We assess the risk involved in that entrepreneur's undertaking. We're the finance folks. When you make your finance decisions, you're risk assessors. And then you say to yourself, if I'm going to take all this risk, is there a chance I'm going to make the kind of return that will compensate me for doing all that? So the finance economics story is one of scarcity to abundance, and the finance folks tell a story about risk and return. Those are the tools J.P. Morgan, Pierpont, he went by his middle name back in the day. That's what Pierpont Morgan did when he was making decisions to solve financial crises before there was a Federal Reserve central bank to fall back on. And we'll touch on some of the ways he was able to reduce the risk involved in motivating private folks to pony up the dough to meet distressed institutions' need for cash. How was he able to reduce that risk and offer private actors a return in the absence of a central bank in order to release the funds that were needed to cover the hot spots in the economy. That's what he did. So John and I have been lucky enough to uncover lots of surprises in our archival research on these, and maybe we'll have a moment to share some of those surprises with you later. But for right now, I am going to pass the baton on to John to explain his viewpoints.
Well, one surprise is unbeknownst to us, when she was working on her MBA at Northwestern, I was working on my PhD at Chicago. So 30 years later, we finally met, and here we are. So actually, I'm an economic historian, and much of what I've studied, perhaps too much, of 1907, I like to take events, patterns from those historical episodes, study them in detail, and then see if anything that's going on today might be reflected in those. And surprisingly, studying the historical events makes understanding today much easier, because you don't have millions of layers of computers and derivatives on top and regulations on top of everything. But the underlying human behavior, responses to incentives, is the same. And 1907 is a great example, which Bob and I might go into more detail later. But 1907 talks about, or reveals to us, the role of shadow banking, the problems with short-term lending, how that under normal conditions it's great for liquidity, but can result in a lot of instability during periods of crisis. The other lesson, not directly related to specific incidents from historical episodes, but also involves understanding what policymakers in the past were thinking about. And this brings to mind the distinction between banking versus monetary policy. We're all familiar with monetary policy. It's in the news way too much. But banking policy has been kind of forgotten, or at least brushed aside, because banking policy tells us about, how should balance sheets be structured, regulation, reserves, things like that. And back when Morgan was mucking around, he didn't have to worry about monetary policy. Whereas today, it became clear with SVB that monetary policy was affecting the balance sheets of some of these banks unintentionally. So I think that's a very important lesson to keep track of, is that banking policy can be as important as monetary policy. It's just not as, for lack of a better word, sexy as banking policy, or as monetary policy is. So those are two big things that I really enjoy about studying history, is that there are just a lot of lessons that can be drawn from the past. And it means we don't have to run around with our hair on fire and worry about what's going on right now, because we've seen this before. If you just sit down for a little bit and say, oh, this is what happened. This is how humans were responding to things. And it makes things like SVB and other banks today no less something to worry a lot about, but it's also something, oh, we've seen this before. So what worked in the past? We might not be able to predict what is going to be the next sore point, but at least we know what things to look for if something starts appearing. And again, I say it's things like short-term lending can be a source of riskiness, maybe strange balance sheets that are too heavily undiversified. And finally, the thing I like about economics, Mary talked about responding to risk and return. Well, the big thing in economics is how people respond to incentives. And that's risk and return responses are exactly an example of how people respond. When the cost of something goes up, we tend to do less of it. So responding to incentives is very much a big part of economics as well as finance. So I think that's why it's a great mix between the two of us. I don't know anything about finance. I won't speak for her, but I'll say she doesn't know anything about economics, and together we cover everything. Right.
Well, I'm especially pleased to see you all here. Thank you for joining us. I know why you're here. I think you're here because you want to learn something about the current turmoil, and here we are talking about events in history. But my message to you would be, we've seen this movie before. Now, we haven't seen it in minute detail. Mark Twain allegedly said, history doesn't repeat itself, it rhymes, it rhymes. And the question would be, well, how have we seen it before? Where has history rhymed in the most recent turmoil of Silicon Valley Bank, Signature, First Republic, Credit Suisse, and others to come? There's some very interesting speculation I might offer, suggest that says we may be in a long running, a slowly expanding financial crisis this time as the Fed's tightening of financial policy continues. So what we're going to discuss today or offer you may not be the end of the story, but I think we can plant some seeds that may put into perspective what you've read in the papers most recently. So where have we seen the movie before? I would offer four hallmarks. Four hallmarks in the context of the recognition that financial crises are extremely noisy events. They differ enormously. They're highly idiosyncratic. It's easy to write very, very separate books about 1907 versus this versus that crisis. But through the work of John Moen, who's one of the most productive research scholars on the Panic of 1907, and Mary Rogers, who's bringing some fantastic new research to the fore, I think we're gaining a better sense of where the regularities are. So the first regularity I'd offer you would be that every crisis is preceded by a boom. Now, the history of the United States has featured numerous economic booms, and they all haven't resulted in a financial crisis. So what is it about a boom that tends to nurture a financial crisis? And the research suggests that they are booms associated with very aggressive expansion of credit, particularly bank credit, but money supply more broadly, and associated with the expansion of credit and money supply would be a growth in speculation. You see valuation multiples in markets begin to rocket upward. Certainly associated with the boom would be optimism, just the belief, hey, house prices have only one way to go, and that's up forevermore, et cetera. Well, we know that there's a tendency, research establishes well, a tendency on the part of humans to simply extrapolate from the past, from recent history, infinitely into the future, and therein may lie a behavioral explanation for how booms and speculative outbursts exist. Anyway, consider the possibility of very aggressive economic booms as a precursor to financial crises. Have we had a boom? Arguably, yes. We've had a massive expansion in money supply in the past 10 to 13 years, depending on where you judge the expansion to have begun. We've seen speculative excesses in fields like tech stocks and cryptocurrencies, some entertainment vehicles, et cetera. Certainly overbuilding in office buildings in the United States now, all that's coming home to roost. But think of a boom as the seedbed for a financial crisis. A second regularity would be shocks. We've mentioned the word. In 1907, the shock that Sean Carr and I argue set in motion the entire down cycle of the crisis was the San Francisco earthquake of April 1906, 18 months before the epicenter of the crisis of 1907. The earthquake led to a contraction in credit and then a recession and then a small speculation on the curb exchange in New York triggered runs on banks, and the panic of 1907 began. But what is it about? I mean, shocks occur all the time. What was it about 1907? What was it about 2023? What was it about 2008 that triggered a crisis? I think you can generalize from those kinds of events, pandemics, earthquakes, shocking declines in house prices and the like, that for a shock to really trigger a crisis, it must be large and costly, unambiguous, surprising, and real in the sense that it affects virtually everyone. It isn't just isolated to a little segment. So shocks tend to trigger crises, big ones. A third takeaway would be that panics generally begin in the shadows. What does that mean? We've all been discussing the role of shadow banking in recent crises. In 2008, it was the mortgage companies or the hedge funds or players who suddenly couldn't meet their financial obligations. In 1907, it was trust companies, unregulated financial institutions that performed the same function as nationally chartered banks, but were less heavily regulated, less well understood, and somewhat more aggressive in their asset management policies, liability management. They paid interest on deposits, which was was frowned on by the orthodox bankers of the day. Today, the periphery would certainly consist of venture capital companies who had major stakes in the tech companies who had large uninsured deposits at many banks, especially concentrated at banks like Silicon Valley National Bank. So pay attention to what's going on in the shadows, and that's very difficult for the everyday person who's trying to be on the lookout for where the next crisis might occur. But you want to remember that the crises rarely begin in the center of the financial system among the very largest financial institutions. Yes, they may emanate toward the largest, toward Lehman, toward Bear Stearns, toward other emblematic large institutions, but they begin in the shadows. Pay attention to what is outside of your ordinary gaze. Final thought would be that, final regularity would be that crises have long coattails. They spill over into politics, economics, and society. Society, quite obviously, in the form of rising unemployment, rising bankruptcies, dislocation, maybe internal demographic movements, shifts of workers from one region to another, perhaps changes in economic welfare, a sharpening of economic inequality, for instance. We've also seen shifts in economic orthodoxy. Suddenly in 1907, as my colleagues up here well understand, the sentiment in the United States shifted from anti-central banking to pro-central banking. How was that? Well, it's a longer story we can talk about during the Q&A period if you like, but following most serious financial crises, we've seen major pivots in political sentiment and major pivots in economic orthodoxy, what the elites, the major thinkers, the policymakers in society deem to be accepted practices. I'll just close with the thought that to fight crises, and indeed we're probably fighting one now in slow motion, but Sean Carr and I argued that you must fight a crisis with speed, flexibility, and clout. Speed, because a crisis is a phenomenon of contagion, of the spread of fear, and you want to restore confidence rapidly. Flexibility, because you want to respond, you want to fight the fire where it is, not where the textbook or where the orthodoxy from the previous crisis would have you believe you should fight the fire. And then clout in the form of material financial resources that can persuade the public at large that, wow, this crisis-fighting crew is likely going to put the flames out. So in 1907, J.P. Morgan, whom our colleagues up here will tell us about, had at his personal disposal in his firm very serious financial resources, plus he had an extraordinary business network upon whom he could call for supplementary resources. In 2008, Henry Paulson, Secretary of the Treasury, talked about the virtue of having a big bazooka to respond to the crisis. And in 2020 and 2023, we've seen the Fed, the Treasury, and the FDIC deploy massive volumes of either taxpayer money or taxpayer guarantees to attempt to quell the crisis. I just leave these thoughts with you to say that history matters, and you can learn a great deal from history to help understand the present day. William Faulkner, former professor here, Nobel Prize winner in literature, said in one of his novels, the past is not dead. The past isn't even the past. And much like veterans or victims of crime, all of us who live through crises, people you may have known who lived through the Great Depression, bear the memories of those events for a lifetime. And what we learn from the present crisis will no doubt inform behavior going forward in response to the very incentives that John Moen was discussing a moment ago.
Yeah, thank you, Bob. One of the things that we talk a lot about when we talk about financial crises are these large systems. The Federal Reserve, obviously very important global financial system, channeling trillions of dollars around. But in many situations, individuals matter, right? Janet Yellen is probably going to be brought in front of congressional committees sooner than later. Jamie Dimon from J.P. Morgan is probably going to be brought in front of congressional committees. We all saw Hank Paulson, Tim Geithner, Ben Bernanke in 2008, 2009. And one of the people that kind of stands out as a legend in American financial history is indeed J.P. Morgan. And played an outsized role in this crisis of 1907. So starting with Mary and also to John, could you give us just a sense of what J.P. Morgan did and why he's important to this story in 1907, and then perhaps what we can learn from how he conducted himself amidst this collapsing financial market?
Or what we should not take away as a lesson that we learned from Morgan's management of crises. So I'll take it away first and pass the baton. Good. So back in the day, he faced Pierpont. He went by Pierpont. He faced a lot of the exact same issues that the New York paper this morning says the Janet and Jamie show are facing today. Rising interest rates that make the bank's bonds go down in value, that lead to fire sale prices on their balance sheets, that lead to bank runs. Morgan also faced reshuffling of deposits among institutions that was lending instability to the New York scene back in the day. In 1895, another crisis he handled, he faced the threat of populist proposals for an alternative currency, like we face today with Bitcoin. He faced a Congress that did not want to raise the debt ceiling, that was unwilling to come to the aid of a financial crisis. He faced the same thing that our leaders face today. We've got this payment mechanism, our check clearing system, right? That's almost a public infrastructure good. We all need it every day to transact business, right? It's almost a public infrastructure good. But our society has decided we're going to house it in a risk-taking framework, the banking system. So we've got this payment mechanism that everybody relies on every day, but we've decided to house it in this risk-taking system called the banks, where they take risks, they make profits, they share dividends with shareholders when their risks turn out right, right? So he faced those same exact things, and we think that he may have been able to quickly muster private market responses to be the savior of the system, not only because of the size of his Rolodex, right, which was massive, but also that he knew where the capacity was in the system. That's what our Federal Reserve does today, right? They have an information network that they rely on to know what's going on, and they have this massive capacity. Bob referred to it just now as the bazooka. Right. So he had to reduce the risk so that he could motivate all his compatriots to participate in saving these societies. How did he do it? Well, it wasn't just phoning up good old boys network. It wasn't just who do I know from the club. He included subject matter experts that fit the particular pragmatic problem that he faced at the moment in each one of his arrangements to provide liquidity where it was needed during a crisis. He called, when he asked his right-hand men to establish, is this institution really insolvent? Is it illiquid? What's going on here? When they couldn't come up with a quick enough assessment, how did he figure out who to save and who to let fail? He relied on who he trusted, who he had trustworthy, repetitive relationships with over many years, right? So that's how he made his decisions during crises. So one might say, well, wow, why can't we just have noble-minded private citizens take the helm today? Why do we need this major financial system or this central bank called the Federal Reserve to do it for us? Well, here's the lesson you cannot draw from Morgan's subject matter experts and knowing where the capacity is strategy. And this goes to the Miller Center's purpose. We live in this democracy where we practice capitalism, right? And our democracy, through its elected representatives in the late 70s, said that Federal Reserve System, it needs to be accountable to the people. And we're going to task it with two tasks so it doesn't do too much mission creep. We're going to say you have to try and maintain full employment and you have to try and maintain a steady price level. Morgan didn't have that because our democracy at the time hadn't passed those laws. That's why you can't draw the lesson from 1907 that Morgan, one single person, can save the whole system anymore. Because the whole system is tasked by a democratic situation to say, hey, Fed, you have much bigger tasks at hand than just these financial crises. Morgan could play this whack-a-mole game and pull a subject matter expert in here and pull one in here and quick solve a problem. Jay Powell, not so much, right? The Fed has to solve these crises within this system that democracy has said, you got to maintain full employment and you got to also watch the price level while you're solving financial crises. So that's a way where history, as John and Bob said, can be used to help us understand how private actors respond, right, to incentives and to risk and return, but how it's different today.
John? Well, I think looking at Morgan's actions is really important. I want to take a step back to 1895, showing how he, at least in the setting of the United States without a central bank, had to do a whole lot of the heavy lifting. In the middle of the 1890s, and the 1890s was just a period of economic disaster in the United States. People always focus on the Great Depression, whereas the 1890s, everything was going wrong. There was a big panic starting in 1893. Agitation for silver was causing political turmoil. And all of that fed into sometimes an overlooked phenomenon, but there was a big run on the stock of gold held by the US Treasury. The US Treasury held a lot of gold for backing money, other issues, but its gold reserve was dwindling rapidly to the point that the U.S. might not be able to stay on the gold standard. And this is where Morgan eventually had to step in and help out after a few, not failed, but ineffectual attempts to bring gold back into the United States. And one thing Morgan had to do was bridge the Atlantic, so to speak, and get the Bank of England and people like Nathan Rothschild to help get gold flowing back into the United States, at the same time holding the hands of Grover Cleveland and keeping the bimetallists at bay. And, you know, Morgan, since the United States had no central bank or formal institution to do that task, Morgan kind of filled the void and coordinated, in some sense, what was going on across the Atlantic, trying to set up incentives, get the prices right to get gold flowing back into the U.S. Treasury so the United States could stay on the gold standard. There was enough uncertainty about that European investors were selling their assets in the United States and shipping the gold back to Europe because they thought, you know, these people might start using silver as money, and you know and today that's, you know, like people using cryptocurrency as money. We just can't have that. So Morgan was able to use his skills and his friends, as Mary mentioned, getting, you know, specialists in to get these flows working right. And that's kind of an unrecognized element in history, that his deep involvement. He also lost money on this whole thing, you know, so he didn't like doing that. But he learned a whole lot about coordinating international big players to to short circuit the international gold standard at the time, to keep the US from actually going off it. Of course, then in 1896, all sorts of things happen and becomes a moot point, and we stay on the gold standard till, well, Roosevelt took us off it basically in the Great Depression. But all this feeds into the Panic of 1907, which we've mentioned a lot. And that was a very focused panic coming out of the trust companies in New York City, affecting unintentionally the national banks, which were playing in the same markets with the trust companies. But at any rate, once the panic started within the trust companies, the national banks, kind of like JP Morgan Chase started taking over deposits. Their deposits started going up during the panic in New York City because the depositors at the trust company were taking their money out and putting it in the national banks. Well, Morgan had to step in right away because there was no central bank yet. We had still to wait 7 more years. But when the Knickerbocker Trust became this obvious start of the panic, he sent in a friend, Benjamin Strong, to see if they could save it. Strong came out and said, no, I can't tell what's going on here. Morgan decided not to save it, but then perhaps realized that was a mistake, and the next day he helps out some other trust companies. But the point is, Morgan knew a lot of people then, had a big connection within New York, and he didn't have to worry about the international stuff because the gold standard wasn't a problem anymore. Whereas in 1895, 96, he had to convince a lot of people to help him out and stuff. By 1907, people knew he knew everybody. He could get his friends like the Rockefellers and the other big bankers, Jim Stillman and Baker and all those guys, to help out to keep the panic from wiping out the stock exchange and other things like that. So in contrast to 1895, the personality of Morgan, he basically took over in the first week of the panic, got his friends to get money together to keep the stock market from collapsing. Once the clearinghouse steps in at the end of the week, he then has the ability to deal with other crises like saving New York City's finances the next week and some big brokerage firms. So the point is, Morgan had been accumulating a lot of knowledge, not just in 1907, but going way back, and as Mary and I argue, maybe back even to his very early days in the 1850s. And he was this repository of who can I call on? How can we save crises? Because there was no backstop. You didn't have to worry about this in England because you had the old Bank of England and the others there. You have the Bank of France that controlled things, could backstop deals. People didn't have to worry about risk as much as they did in the United States. And I think, and Morgan's actions in 1907, his personal interests appear to have aligned with the general interest, because he lost even more money because of 1907. In fact, so much that we're speculating that he started thinking, I can't do this anymore, or my friends just can't do this anymore. We need somebody else to provide liquidity during a crisis. And because he lost a lot of money, you can see that this is kind of leading to a hypothesis we have that either he pushed for a central bank, or at least he got out of the way and let politics move its course to having some sort of more centralized source of liquidity that did not rely purely on his unique bits of knowledge. Because we don't think there was any other financier of his caliber that knew as much as he did, knew as many people as he did. Now, how does that translate today? Well, I think in 2008, we got lucky by having Ben Bernanke and all his knowledge of economic history helping out, because I don't think if we had him, I think that, and realizing what had happened in the Great Depression by letting things fail, letting too many things go on, things may have turned out quite differently in 2008. So even today, with all our regulators and important institutions like the Fed, if you don't have the right people running them, things can perhaps not work out like you think. And to finish up on this theme, there's a great theme coming out of The Great Monetary History of the United States by Milton Friedman and Anna Schwartz. And they argue, and I'm using their words, I'm not saying this is true, but they explain or try to explain the adept behavior of the Federal Reserve System in the early bits of the Great Depression because of the untimely death of Benjamin Strong, who had worked with Morgan in 1907 and before, become the governor of the bank, Federal Reserve Bank of New York, and had a lot of knowledge as to how these things worked. But he died in 1928, and his replacement, can't remember who he was, clearly didn't have the same stock of, well, I don't remember a lot of Federal Reserve Bank presidents, but whoever replaced Strong didn't have the same stock of knowledge. And to rely purely on better regulation, more regulation, well, it seems that you have to have the right people using it so it's effective. And if I guess to draw a modern parallel, and I'm not criticizing, but it appears that in the case of SVG, the San Francisco Federal Reserve Bank had cited them and warned them a number of times in the year or two before this about, there are some things you need to change. But nothing happened apparently with that. Now, I'm not an expert on Federal Reserve regulation, so you'll have to call one of those people to find out more detail. Could the San Francisco Fed have done anything, or were they just warning us about things? But this is the thing, when you start seeing warnings like that, and if you have the right people telling you that, you might want to start paying attention.
Yeah, please remember, if you have any questions, please fill out the cards, and online, if you have any questions, please put those in the Q&A function, and we'll be sure to get those up to us. I'm kind of synthesizing one question from here in the room for Bob, and then for our panelists as well. This is a lot of power that somebody like JP Morgan has, or even the big bankers of today like Jamie Dimon or Jay Powell. He says one wrong word, trillions of dollars change course in the course of the day. Is this healthy for a democracy to have so much power vested in such a small group of people that may or may not be accountable to the people that they're influencing?
So this was a major concern for progressives during the first decade of the 20th century. In fact, there had been actually brewing since the 1870s, 1880s, 1890s, populist movements that began to worry about the behavior and interests of the elites, both financial and political, et cetera, in the country. And the sense that crystallized in the design of the U.S. Federal Reserve System was to take that power of being a lender of last resort and giving it to a public servant rather than a private figure such as J.P. Morgan or another leader. In fact, one of the very interesting backstory debates about founding the Fed was that the very first proposal for the design of a central bank populated the Federal Reserve Board with bankers. And Woodrow Wilson, who was elected president in 1912, and who pushed the development of the Federal Reserve enabling legislation. Wilson and William Jennings Bryan, his Secretary of State, insisted that there be no bankers on the Federal Reserve Board, that they all be public servants. And as a result, we see the crystallization of that very concern about overweening power in the person of J.P. Morgan and others. But I would just second John's remarks and Mary's just now, that the story of 1907 and I think the story of 2023 have in their midst an element of what we might call human agency, that a few people in responsible positions were prepared to step forward and take actions that would help to address the crisis and do so very effectively. Certainly J.P. Morgan did. John Mary mentioned that he actually lost money in his crisis fighting attempts in the 1890s and in 1907. So he wasn't doing it to exploit weak adversaries. He understood how threatening and destabilizing the crisis could be for the entire nation, and he wanted to do something about it.
Something to add?
Yeah, please.
Just to kind of work off Bob and John's comments, another intriguing connection between the preparedness of today's leaders back to Pierpont and his cohort is the persistence of the knowledge in our economy to fight for fighting financial crises in private companies like at J.P. Morgan Chase Bank, but also, somewhat surprisingly, in the law firms. Davis Polk and Sullivan Cromwell, as we've probably been reading recently, you've probably been reading recently, are two law firms that often act during crises to actually recombine the banks that are under siege. But the way we tie that today is Morgan's corporate attorney, Frank Stetson, was a partner at the predecessor to Davis Polk. And where did Jay Powell work in his first law jobs out of George G.W., right? At Davis Polk. So Jay Powell gets his start at the same firm that Morgan, his corporate attorney, worked at in resolving financial crises. So this persistent of these repositories of knowledge on how to solve crises is finding it in private companies is just fascinating.
I have a great question that came in just now. I love this. Fantastic. So this is for all three, whoever wants to jump on this one. If financial crises are indeed social crises, how should banks and policymakers combat the human tendencies towards mania, recency bias, and the power of popular narratives? Who wants to jump on that one?
I will. I'm not going to answer it in the grand scheme, but I think one thing to watch for in deal with mania and social things is just, do you see something, a bank in this context, growing really rapidly? That was a problem I read about with SVG. It was growing so rapidly that perhaps the people in charge of the bank weren't paying attention, not in the sense that they're up to anything sinister, it's just they're so filled with, look what's going on, that they didn't realize that they didn't quite have everything under control. Historical parallel to that was, as Bob and I have talked about at length, was the rapid, incredibly rapid growth of trust companies, state chartered intermediaries in the state of New York, outside of all federal regulatory agencies, that grew tremendously rapidly after 1896 to the extent that within New York City, they had become as big in terms of volume of assets as the big national banks. So I think this is a small example of being socially aware and the issue of mania and other things that make panics really exciting things to study, apart from balance sheets, of course.
Well, I would add that there are strong norms within the financial community against manic speculation. Whether individual participants listen to those norms or choose to model them is another matter. But Mary is a chartered financial analyst. The CFA Institute, which is headquartered here in Charlottesville, Virginia, has codes of ethics that counsel private wealth managers to discourage their clients from intemperately responding to opportunities, acting out manic actions in wealth management decisions and the like. I know that lawyers are also compelled by similar codes of ethics. At the end of the day, however, individual actors may not listen to the best of advice. And what do? It's possible that the individual client of a bank can survive to the next day, the next month, the next year, and say, see, I didn't listen to that awful advice. I went out and did X and I made a lot of money. But that's a lot like walking across a busy highway blindfolded. If you survive to the other side, you can feel very self-righteous in your investing success, but you have no idea of the extraordinary risks you've taken in the process. In some of the writing I've been doing most recently, I've discussed the neglect of one of the great virtues in Western civilization. There are 7 major virtues that harken back to ancient times, and teachers, philosophers regard the cardinal virtue to be prudentia, prudence. That sounds so lofty, so puritanical these days, and yet if you study the literature and the dictionary definitions of prudence, they all hearken toward foresightfulness. And if anything, I think what we learn from financial crises is the absence of foresight, the absence of that wisdom to say, wait a second, let's look around the corner. Let's imagine what's coming at us over the horizon. And the best asset managers, the best financial advisors, the best legal counsel I know, always counsel prudence and foresight.
Yeah, I was going to ask Mary to comment on this one.
Thanks. For each one of you in the room and everybody watching online with us, in order to avoid that trap, that fear of missing out, they call it FOMO now, right, of these returns and all these strange, are they really assets? I don't know, is to flip the risk-reward question in your own life. Instead of saying, I'm targeting a return of 10% a year, target your risk and let the reward, the return, fall into place. And that might help you overcome those personal, failings we all have of thinking we're smarter than we really are. We hate admitting it, right? Well, if you just don't say, I need a 10% return, do what it takes to get me there. Say, I can only let my portfolio go down on average 5% a year. That's how much risk I'm willing to take. go ahead and target my return so that that risk doesn't come back to haunt me. Oh, so now you know your risk. Oh, so if you look at a cryptocurrency, you'll see a little more than a 5% chance of loss in a year, won't you? So it might help you say, oh, okay, that's not for me. And that might help you make your practical behavior improve. Should we be judgmental? I don't know. Bob's nodding. Bob says yes, so I say okay, right? So try that.
Yeah. One question, you've got a panel of nerds up here, everybody. I also am teaching a class on financial crises right now in the current term. And one thing I tell my students at the beginning of the semester is, for those of you going into finance, going into business, the question is not whether you will use history, it's whether you will use it well or whether you will use it poorly. And my job is to teach you how to use it well. So then the question I want to put to our esteemed panelists, for the people in this room and watching online, some of whom may be in finance, some of whom may be not, how can we use history, and especially these financial and economic history questions, how can we learn to use this history well, or at minimum, prevent ourselves from using it poorly?
I think history informs prudence. History builds foresight. History builds a sense of risk exposure. Study history. There's no shortcut.
And study economic history in particular.
And study finance. No. Do you want to add anything? All right.
I guess the question is, why is this history so potentially relevant? Because I would make the argument to my students that not just looking to one event in the past, but actually looking at the broad sweep will actually help us in ways that we can't even begin to imagine. So if we're looking for history in a more practical sense, like, what should we be looking for? What should we try to learn?
Well, I think in the context of financial examples, but other things get more and more complicated. Like finance today, many more layers of things on top of it. But the point of studying history is to look at the underlying human behavior. And I'll bet reactions to incentives, behavioral relationships, and things like that were exactly the same in 1907 as they were in 2008. It's just that 2008, the magnitudes were immense compared to although 1907 wasn't small, but it's still the underlying human behavior, and we're going to react the same to financial incentives, regulations, pretty much in predictable ways that we can see what happened in the past. So it just, from my point of view, doesn't mean we shouldn't be worried about crises. It doesn't, it's just say, take a few seconds and think, well, we've seen things like this before, so what do we do now? Rather than trying to recreate something completely from whole cloth and start fresh. There's a lot to learn from examples in the past.
Mary, do you want to comment on that?
Well, yeah, thanks very much. And I would say, echoing Bob and John's points, trust matters a lot. Trust in individuals, not just trust in institutions, but trust in individual people really matters. Artificial intelligence isn't going to change that. Derivatives upon derivatives upon derivatives isn't going to change that, right? So I do think it gets back to make sure that when our Senate confirmations for appointing people to decision-making roles that we have at the Federal Reserve, be patient with the senators, right? Try and understand what's going on behind those confirmation decisions. Trying to get the right people in the right position really, really, really matters. And get the right people in your own lives, right? Your own CPAs, your own financial advisors, your own attorneys. It's easy to take financial advice from your brother-in-law or something, and nothing against my two wonderful brothers-in-law, right? But, you know, it's that keeping up with the Joneses and fear of missing out. Don't let that happen. Don't let partisan squabbles come in the way of picking really good people, right? That's what I would say.
Yeah, last word to Bob. If people are to pick up your book or any of the books that you cite in this volume, on a top level, what would you like people to take away from this kind of thing?
Well, I think one important theme I'd like you to take away that has already been highlighted by my colleagues here is the vital role of leadership. And this is close to my heart as a business school professor. I think it's important in fields of law and public policy. Our Batten School here at the University of Virginia emphasized the role of leadership. It's easy to think in macro terms about the big tides, the big forces that push us this way and that. But the truth is, we all have an opportunity to lead in little circles of people, reminding our brothers-in-law, no, that's don't go there. But even in our communities, in our businesses, in our local governments, and even on a national stage, speak up if you're concerned about something. Do not assume somebody else is going to get it done.
And with those words of wisdom, we will leave it there. I'd like to ask you to join me in thanking Mary Rogers, John Moen, and Bob Bruner. Thank you so much for joining us, and we will see you here at the Miller Center soon.